translated by Donald Rayfield. Chapter Pushover. The bare hills were white with a bluish tinge, like loaves of sugar. Round and treeless, they were covered with a thick layer of packed snow, which the winds had consolidated. In the gullies the snow was deep and strong enough to hold a man, but on the hill slopes it was puffed up as if in enormous bubbles. These were bushes of dwarf pine that crept over the ground and flattened themselves for hibernation before the first snow fell. This pine was what we were after. Of all the trees in the north, the dwarf pine or cedar was my favorite. I had long ago understood and treasured the enviable haste with which impoverished northern nature, destitute as it was, strove to share its simple riches with human beings by producing all of its flowers as quickly as it could. It took only a week to bring everything into blossom, and in little more than a month after the beginning of summer, when the sun never set, the mountains would shine red with lingonberries and black with blueberries. The bushes of large, watery yellow rowan were so low you didn't have to lift your hand. The honey-flavored mountain briar had rose petals, the only local flower that smelled of flowers. All the other flowers smelled only of damp, of marsh, and that fit with the silence of the birds in spring, the silence of the larch forest, whose branches were slow to grow green needles. The briar held on to its hips until the first frosts and would offer us its chewy wrinkled berries, with a hard violet skin concealing their sweet, dark yellow flesh. I knew the cheerful vines that in spring changed color many times from dark pink to orange to pale green, as if bound in colored leather. The larches stretched out their fine fingers and green fingernails, while ubiquitous thick willow herb covered the ground wherever the forest had been burned down. All this was beautiful, trusting, noisy, and hasty, but it happened only in summer when the old olive-green grass mingled with the new grass on the mossy rocks that shone in the sun and suddenly turned out to be green instead of grey and brown. In winter all this vanished. It was covered with porous, hard snow, driven by the wind into the gullies and packed down so hard that you had to cut steps with an axe if you wanted to climb a hill. You could see a man in the forest half a mile away, so bare was the landscape. There was only one evergreen tree, the dwarf pine or dwarf evergreen cedar. It forecast the weather. 2 or 3 days before the first snow fell, when there was still an autumnal warmth in the air and the sky was cloudless and nobody wanted to think about the approach of winter, the dwarf pine would suddenly lower its enormous, 12-foot paws and bend its straight black trunk, as thick as 2 fists, so as to lie face down on the ground. 1 or 2 days would pass and a small cloud would appear. By the next evening a blizzard would gather and snow would fall. If in late autumn, low snow clouds gathered and a cold wind blew, but the dwarf pine did not lie down, then you could be absolutely sure that there would be no snow. At the end of March and in April, before there was even a hint of spring, and when the air had its wintry thinness and dryness, the dwarf pine would suddenly rise up, shaking the snow off its green, slightly reddish clothing. A day or 2 later the wind would change and warm streams of air would bring spring with them. The dwarf pine was a very precise instrument, so sensitive that at times it could make mistakes. It would rise up during a thaw, if the thaw was prolonged. It never rose up before a thaw. But before the thaw ended it would quickly lie down in the snow again. Occasionally something else would happen. If you got a hot campfire going in the morning so as to have somewhere to warm your hands and legs at dinner time, you would put on as many logs as you could and then go to work. 2 or 3 hours later the dwarf pine would poke its branches out of the snow and carefully straighten up, thinking spring had come. Before the fire had gone out, however, the dwarf pine would bed itself down in the snow again. In these regions winter has two colors, the pale blue of the high sky, and the white of the earth. In spring last year's dirty yellow rags are revealed. For a very long time the earth is dressed in these pauper's clothes, until the new greenery gets enough strength to start to bloom, hastily and violently. It is in the middle of this mournful spring and pitiless winter that the dwarf pine turns a bright, dazzling green and shines forth. What's more, it produces nuts, tiny pine nuts. This is a delicacy that people share with nutcracker birds, bears, squirrels, and chipmunks. We chose an area on the windward side of the hill. We dragged a load of small and slightly larger branches. We tore up dry grass on the bare patches where the wind had driven the snow off the hill. Before we left the barracks, we had taken some smoldering coals from the stove, since there were no matches to be had. We carried the coals in a big tin can with a piece of wire for a handle. We took care to keep the coals alight on our journey. When I took them out of the can, I blew on them, gathered the smoldering lumps in a pile, raised a flame, and put them on the branches with some dry grass and twigs to make a bonfire. I then covered it all with bigger branches, and soon the wind drew forth a precarious bluish smoke. This was the first time I had worked in a brigade collecting dwarf pine needles. The work had to be done by hand. The dry green needles had to be plucked like game bird feathers. You had to take as big a handful as you could, then stuff them into sacks, and in the evening you handed over your harvest to the guard. The pine needles were then carted off to a mysterious vitamin processing plant, where they produced a thick, sticky, dark yellow extract that tasted unspeakably foul. Every time before we had lunch, we were made to drink or eat this extract. You got it down the best way you could. The taste not only spoiled lunch and dinner, but many people regarded this medication as just an extra way for the camp to get at you. You weren't given your lunch until you downed a small glass of this medication. They were strict about that. Scurvy affected everyone, and dwarf pine needles were the only treatment approved by medicine. Faith conquers all things, and although this concoction was later proven to be utterly useless as a means of preventing scurvy and then renounced, and the processing plant was closed down, in our time people still had to take this stinking rubbish, spitting afterward to get rid of the taste, as they recovered from scurvy, or, rather, failed to recover, or recovered from scurvy despite not taking it. There were rose hips to be had everywhere, but nobody processed them or used them to combat scurvy, since rose hips were not mentioned in the instructions issued in Moscow. A few years later they started importing rose hips from the mainland, but as far as I know, nobody ever thought of processing the local ones. The instructions considered pine needles to be the sole source of vitamin C, and I was now a producer of this valuable raw material. I had lost my strength, so I was transferred from the gold mine pit face to pick pine needles. "You'll go and gather dwarf pine needles," the supervisor told me one morning. "I'll give you a pushover of a job for a few days." Pushover, or cant, was a widespread term in the camps, meaning something like a temporary break, not a complete break, for that the term was a swell. Someone would be swelling for a day. Pushover meant work that didn't exhaust you, temporary light work. Dwarf pine work was considered not merely easy but in fact very easy. It was prized because you had no guards on your back. After many months of work in icy open pits where every stone, shining with frost, burned your hands, after the clicking of rifle bolts, the barking of dogs, and the foul cursing of the guards behind you, working with dwarf pines was an enormous pleasure that was relished by every single tired muscle. Normally, people were sent to work while it was still dark, for pine needles you were sent off later. It was good to warm your hands on a can full of smouldering coals, to amble slowly to the hills, which were so impossibly far away, I used to think, as I climbed higher and higher, all the time relishing my isolation and the deep silence of the mountains in winter as an unexpected joy, as if everything bad in the world had vanished and there was only yourself and your comrade and the endless narrow dark path in the snow, leading high up to somewhere in the mountains. My comrade didn't approve of my slowness. He had been gathering pine needles for a long time and quite rightly suspected that I would be a weak and incompetent partner. The work was done in pairs, and the results were shared equally between us. "I'll cut the branches, and you sit down and pick the needles," he told me. "And be lively about it, or we won't meet the norm. I don't want to be sent back to the mines again." "You have to work faster," my partner said when he came back with another armful. "That's no good, man." I didn't need telling that it was no good, but I couldn't work any faster. I had a ringing in my ears, and my fingers, which had been frostbitten that winter, were aching again with a familiar dull throb. I stripped the needles, broke up whole branches into smaller pieces, trying not to strip the bark, and stuffed the result into the sack. But there was no way I could fill the sack. There was now a whole mountain of stripped branches, looking like washed bones, surrounding the bonfire, but the sack still had plenty of room and could take in more armfuls of needles. My partner began helping me. Things moved faster. "Time we went home," he suddenly said. "Or we'll miss supper. This isn't enough for the norm." Then he picked a big stone from the bonfire ash and shoved it into the sack. "They won't untie the sack there," he said with a frown. "Now we've met the norm." I got up, scattered the burning branches, and raked snow over the still red coals. The bonfire hissed and went out. It instantly became cold, and it was clear that evening was falling. My partner helped me shoulder the sack. I swayed under the weight. "Then drag it on the ground," he said. "It's downhill all the way." We were only just in time to get our soup and tea. Men doing such light work were not meant to have a second course.